Welcome to everybody. It's great to see so many people, and as we're getting quite used to on these Zoom and other platforms, it's disconcerting that you can't see everybody on the screen at the same time, but you'll be able to scroll backwards and forwards across the screen and see the others that are there. But just to give you a bit of an overview as to who is on this call and what this is about. So as you know, this event is organised by the Impact Initiative, funded by the ESRC and DFID, and primarily on the call there are grant holders who are funded by ESRC and DFID on the Raising Learning Outcomes programme, as well as grant holders from the Global Challenges Research Fund who have got projects on education. Now, the exciting thing about that is that we have people whose research is at the perhaps towards the end, people who've done their data collection, have maybe started or finished analysis, etc., alongside colleagues, particularly on the Global Challenges Research Fund, who are just setting out and were probably just setting out at a time when schools closed. The possibility to actually do the research that you're envisaging is no longer possible as things currently stand, and perhaps sort of in a bit of a dilemma as to what this is actually going to mean. As well as I'd like to also welcome those colleagues and friends that we have on the call who are more from the sort of policy and NGO world, who've been engaging with the Impact Initiative over the past 5 years or so in one way or another. So we've got a range of different perspectives of people on this call. So what, as you know, we were supposed to be having a workshop for the RLO programme that was going to be in Addis Ababa, and we were also supposed to be having an event with the colleagues from the Global Challenges Research Fund to start thinking about how to address impact in research projects from a very early stage of the research. So of course, neither of those have been able to take place. So we have these webinars that are in some way not replacing, but an alternative to those. And as a beginning, we thought it might be just helpful for us collectively to reflect on what we actually mean about trying to achieve impact in the context of the current pandemic and in the context of COVID-19, recognizing that we're going to have to think very differently about it. So I think there's questions about what it is that policy actors are going to expect, what funders are going to expect, what we as researchers and everyone here as researchers think is going to be appropriate and possible and feasible, and importantly, what researchers feel is the support that is going to be needed in going forward in whatever practical way that might be. Maybe just to sort of say very briefly, obviously there's very different ways of understanding impact, and those of you that have been part of the Raising Learning Outcomes programme will be familiar probably with the way that we've been defining it in the Impact Initiative, which very much relates to the ESRC definition and form of reporting. So it includes thinking about conceptual impact, that's sort of changing ways of thinking, whether that's to do with changing ways that governments might think about inclusive education, for example. It ideally also includes instrumental impact, which refers to actually changing something, seeing some actual change in policy or practice. So that might mean actually seeing something happen within the classroom, the ways that teachers are recruited, perhaps, as an example. But it's also about the sort of processes, the networks and connections that are made that are important for achieving those forms of impact and how we go about those. So it can relate to a range of things, but important to think about what that means, as I said, in the current context. So this is the sort of thing that we're going to hopefully be discussing today with our distinguished panelists, and then with plenty of time for discussion. I'm just going to start by a few points of housekeeping, just so that everybody is aware that this session is going to be recorded. It is actually already being recorded and ultimately uploaded onto the Impact Initiative YouTube channel. So if anyone has any problem with that, please let us know, and we won't be doing immediately afterwards, but quite soon afterwards. There will also be live tweeting taking place. So if there's anything you don't want to be live tweeted, Anything you think is sensitive, then please also just alert us as you're saying what you're about to say. We have our colleague Jorge here, who is going to be illustrating the event as we go along. And maybe, Lewis, if you could just put up Jorge's illustration so far to give people an idea as to what this is going to involve. So this is our pre-event illustration, which I find quite frightening, but unfortunately perhaps quite real as well. So Jorge will be filling this out as we speak with things that we're all saying, and hopefully at the end there'll be a chance to get a quick glimpse of where Jorge has reached so far with the illustration. For the tweeting and other things, colleagues might take a screenshot of the webinar. So if you don't want to be on that, please also let us know, perhaps put something in the chat box to the Impact Initiative privately if you'd prefer, just so that we can then make sure that you're not included. And at the end of the event, we want to make sure that it's not just us talking now, but other people have a chance to hear about what we've been saying, to reflect on things and give ourselves further opportunities to reflect. So we will be writing up a brief report and would very much welcome your ideas and thoughts into that, both if you've got ideas that you want to put on the chat box as we go along, but also afterwards. And we might well just also come after some of you to write blogs, and if anyone would like to offer to do so, that would be most welcome as well. So I think hopefully I've covered all the housekeeping. Elizabeth, have I missed anything? Is that okay? So I think if I don't want to spend any more time, because it's more important to hear the panelists and also from yourselves. So I'm now going to introduce the panelists very briefly. They've been given just only 7 minutes to speak each, so a very short period of time, but I'm asking if they would just say something about at the beginning as they're speaking about their own roles and where relevant their relationship to ESRC, DFID and or GCRF programs. So the first speaker is going to be Mohohlwane, who is the Deputy Director of the Research Monitoring and Evaluation Department of Basic Education in South Africa. This is followed by Tristan McCowan from the University College London Institute of Education, who has both an RLO and a GCRF hat on. Suman Bhattacharjea, who is the Director of Research at the ASER Centre in India, and Laura Savage, who is Senior Advisor in the DFID Education Research Team. So I'll go in those order. We'll hear from all 4 speakers first, and then we'll have an opportunity to have the question and answers after that. So please do sort of already be reflecting. And as I said before, if you want to be putting things in the chat as we go along, please do so. So without further ado, Mpumi, could I now hand over to you? Remember to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Great. As I've been introduced, my name is Nompumelelo, working in the National Department of Basic Education in South Africa. My relationship with ESRC is based on 2 rounds of grants that focused on a collaboration with the University of Stellenbosch, as well as a few other universities working on reading and measuring the relationship between reading and school leadership and management. Yeah, so that's in terms of my intro. Can I go ahead and answer the question? Great. Okay, so I've been asked.
Maybe Mpumi, I should actually ask you the question. That is very true. So let me just start by, so I've got a question for everybody. I was so eager to hear from you. So I guess you've had a lot of experience both on the research side, but also on the policy side. So I think for the purpose of this, it's really interesting to hear from the perspective of a government, from the perspective of a Ministry of Education, where you're having rapidly to change your circumstances, to adapt your programming in the light of COVID-19. What do you think is the most helpful way for researchers to engage with people like yourselves, other government actors, recognizing how busy everybody is and the competing demands and the most immediate demands? And perhaps if there are any good examples of where you've seen this happen recently.
Sure. So I think it's important to just remind ourselves of the context of government and its role. And firstly, government's mandate is to deliver services, right? So that's still the mandate of government. And particularly during this pandemic, it's to protect citizens. But the context has shifted in that there's restricted movement. There is a reallocation of program funds, so things that had been planned now are not going to happen, and potentially less money will be available for programs in the future. And then there's obviously the restrictions in terms of oh, well, unpredictability, sorry, I spoke about the restrictions already. Unpredictability in terms of planning for the next 18 months, what's going to happen. The hope is there's a vaccine and in 18 months we get back to normal, but we've been looking for an HIV vaccine for years now. So I think that's an important thing to be keeping in mind. But I think enough time has lapsed now that this creates a new opportunity to engage between policymakers and researchers. I think for a lot of researchers, we've been waiting for the moment where government can listen to you. This is your moment. We are waiting for ideas. And what I mean in this is the role of government to still deliver services is real, but sometimes some parameters that had previously seemed like they could never shift can shift. So in the case of South Africa, for example, there have been people who have been working from a university perspective and motivating for an unemployment grant to be distributed to everyone who's unemployed. So we have several grants, but we don't have a basic unemployment grant. And that the moment for that has come. So that is now being shared and taken up. So this grant is being distributed. And so I think one way to engage with government is to look at your previous research and see if there's a policy area that you've already been working on where you have evidence that could now be taken up. But if that has not been something you've been able to do, of course, because we can't predict the future from previous work, that kind of rollout of the social grant in the case of South Africa presents an opportunity for new researchers to get involved in that. So you may then partner with the people who had initially proposed this and help research or evaluate the rollout. Who gets it? How long do they get it for? How has it helped people or changed things? So yeah, taking on research ideas that are being implemented and seeing how you can bring your new skills to this. Then there's also, I think, massive opportunities to reanalyze existing data, to speak to information gaps, where we previously, for example, the social distancing issue is a big thing. So in thinking about schools reopening, one of the factors has been, will children experience increasing exposure to catching COVID-19? And so a useful thing that has been done has been finding other people's data from time diaries and seeing where contact has been established, how much more are children exposed than adults, and reanalyzing that and presenting that to government as, hey, here's something, it's quick, it's based on 1 or 2 sources, it's not as extensive as I previously would have done, but where there is a gap in information, here's something you can use. So finding data sets that exist, using your expertise and speaking into that. And then I think thirdly, a space for innovation. So for a long time, technology has been seen as this big thing that should be happening around connectivity, around using it to teach, etc. In most developing country contexts, that is not happening. That is, we don't have the infrastructure to make this happen, but it does mean there will probably be more appetite in the future to get technology sorted. So you could be future oriented in that way, not have to interact with government per se right now, but make sure you're collecting information that should have a moment soon in the next 2, 3, or maybe even 4, 5 years. And then that's just practical ways or different kinds of research that you could be contributing to. But I think in general, two general sentiments. One is it's a time to be helpful rather than a time to be critical. And that is not to say you can't present information that contradicts what government is saying, but I think the general, if you're trying to get a policymaker's ear and attention when they're being pressed on information they've never had to produce before, being helpful as your posture would be useful and would give you an audience. And then finally, I think be clear, be concise in your requests, and know what you are asking for. So I sometimes get a lot of requests for data that is already on our website or reports that are already on the website. And then it takes away from a request from someone who had an idea or something they really wanted to test with me. So I would say that's probably something you can try. And final one, the more senior the policymaker you're trying to access is, the more you won't get hold of them. So if it used to be difficult to find the minister, good luck with that right now. So I would encourage you to spend some time in terms of thinking of your network and what information you actually need, so you can identify the right person who's more in the middle of the road rather than right at the top, so that your research isn't waiting for a response from the minister's office. I think that's it.
Thank you so much. I think really practical and constructive ideas. I'm just going to switch the timer off so it doesn't ping at me. It's a good time too. So thank you for those ideas, which I'm sure people will have more questions to come back to. So I'm going to now move to Tristan. So Tristan, again, if you could start by introducing yourself, but I'll just sort of put my question to you so that you can answer that at the same time. So your research for the Global Challenges Research Fund was designed before COVID-19. At the same time, you've also been part of an RLO project, which I guess is coming to an end, or is at an end, and for which an impact case study has been written up. So presumably the plans for your GCRF project have had to change somewhat, I would imagine. And so therefore, what you've wrote up in your pathways to impact and your plans for impact will have had to change potentially. So it'd be interesting to hear from you how you've been thinking about adapting your plans for achieving impact, and what type of support and from whom you think would be helpful for yourself and perhaps for others in that same situation in this current context. Thanks, Tristan.
Great, thanks very much, Pauline. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here and to see lots of old friends. It's hard to greet people on this platform, isn't it? But anyway, I'm sending you an implicit greeting, and also to see lots of new faces as well, who I hope I'll meet in other occasions. So I'm Tristan McCowan, and as Pauline said, there are two projects that are relevant to this. One which has actually finished now, which is was an RLO project, and that's Pedagogies for Critical Thinking, Innovation and Outcomes in African Higher Education, working with universities in Botswana, Kenya and Ghana. So the project's finished, but we have actually got a follow-on fund for that for impact and capacity building, but we've actually delayed the start of that until January. So I'm actually going to focus more on the GCRF project, and that's transforming universities for a changing climate. So that's working with universities in Mozambique, Kenya, Brazil and Fiji, and also partnering from UCL, which is my institution. And the aim of the project is to bring impact on climate change adaptation and mitigation through university interventions in those 4 countries. So using participatory action research groups, interventions that are developed locally that could be of a community engagement type, that could be a teaching and learning, could be of a sustainability plan for the campus and so forth. And then generating knowledge which we can then use to build a better understanding of higher education's role in sustainable development, broadly speaking. So this is a project obviously relating to higher education. I think some of the issues in universities are different from schools. So it might be quite interesting. I mean, I imagine most of the projects you're engaged with at school level, there might be some slightly different issues there, although when we're talking about impact, some common ones. And it's worth mentioning that our impact, as well as partnering with universities in those countries, our impact partner is the Association of Commonwealth Universities. And I'll refer back to them because obviously they're very relevant in the networking work that we're doing as well. So I'll make a few comments in relation to the 4 quadrants of the wheel that Pauline mentioned. And I'm not just saying this because we're being hosted by the Impact Initiative, but it is a really useful frame. So thinking about the conceptual, the instrumental, capacity building and the networking. And I think also those intersect with questions of scale. So we're also thinking of kind of micro level individuals and communities, and then meso level institutions and macro levels of national and global and so forth. And I think that the considerations are quite different at those different scales and with the different types of impact and the kinds of influences that the coronavirus pandemic has had on them and the adaptations that we've had to make. firstly, the conceptual. So if we're thinking about how we change ideas, at first sight, this is probably the least affected because we work to a large extent through texts and virtual communications anyway. And what we've done there is we've intensified the kinds of literature-based work that we're doing, policy analyses and so forth. And in terms of changes that we've made, I suppose we've been forced to be a bit more creative in terms of the types of output that we're doing and different kinds of engagement through social media and briefs. And we're still at very early stages now. The project started at the beginning of February, but because we haven't been able to start the more practical aspects of the research, we've been focusing more on those ones. A lot that can be done in that area, but I think it's important to point out that if we're thinking about anything more than simply transmission of information and the type of deep changes in belief and perception that are important when we're talking about something like climate change, that implies a fundamental shift to the way our societies are organized and way our lives are organized, it requires a very sustained form of dialogue and reflection, which is not impossible without face-to-face contact, but it is made more difficult. And so I think we do need to think beyond simply spreading information and to create those kinds of possibilities for transformative learning and Freirean dialogue and so forth through virtual spaces. The second is the instrumental. And so in terms of bringing actual changes to practice and policy, well, the project has built into it change at the local level all the way through the project. So that's the research comes out of that rather than the impact coming out of the findings of the research. And that has had a very, very obvious impact. We haven't been able to start that kind of work. At the moment, we're playing a waiting game. It's so dependent on the university's opening and to having face-to-face interactions with students and communities that we've put that on hold, and we're hoping that we'll be able to start that at some point. But clearly, if we can't, then we'll have to rethink that radically. But at the moment, we're simply waiting on that. Of course, you know, the influences on policy and so forth can take place in a virtual environment. Nompumelelo, mentioned difficulties of contacting policymakers, and of course that becomes more difficult through virtual, particularly in certain cultural contexts where face-to-face interactions are particularly important. And I don't know if others have any reflections on how different cultures mediate different forms of interaction, but certainly not being able to hold the face-to-face, the stakeholder meetings and so forth that we have had planned has made it difficult. And that's certainly an area that we as a project would appreciate support from impact initiative and so forth, is to try and mediate some of those interactions. Capacity building, I sense my time has probably run out, so I'll move on swiftly. Capacity building is an area that we've really been working on even though we haven't been able to start the main part of our data collection. We have 11 research associates across the whole project, mostly early career researchers, with very different levels of experience. And so we've been, even though we haven't been able to hold the team event that we've been planning to, we've developed a whole new schedule of virtual, very regular meetings, and we're setting up reading group to try and get we felt it's important to get the intellectual engagement. In a lot of those meetings, you tend to talk about very practical things, but we want something that's sort of disassociated from that, so we can keep the creativity, intellectual work going. So we've worked hard to develop that across all of our researchers, of course, but particularly the early career researchers. And finally, the networks.
So when you
Sorry?
I said my alarm is now going.
Okay,
so.
Just a word on networks and networks is something which we've been continuing the work that we would have done anyway. We've been working with the Association of Commonwealth Universities and its Commonwealth Climate Resilience Network to try and engage new partners in the research in some form. So not as a full partner, but to either use our survey or the methodology for our participatory research groups, or to affiliate in other ways to the project, as well as being recipients of any findings we might generate, to actually participate in an affiliate way with the project. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Perhaps we can continue the discussions afterwards.
Great, thank you so much, Tristan. I think there is so much to think about and say, and I think this point that you were saying about, we wrote together with a number of grant holders as an IDS bulletin on partnerships and how important it is to have informal alongside formal processes to achieve impact. And along with what you were saying about in the context where you can't have face-to-face meetings, how do we go about this? What are the other opportunities and possibilities? Anyone who's got thoughts or experiences on that would be great. Just a quick request. If you have entered with a name on your screen that isn't yours, if you're able to change it, and I believe you can do this by hovering over your picture, at the top of your picture there should then be, top right hand corner, 3 dots. And it allows you, if you look down, there's rename, and then you should be able to type in your name. If you wouldn't mind doing that, that will just be helpful when we come on to the question and answers, amongst other things. If that doesn't work for you, again, if you can just check with the Impact Initiative, Lewis, who might be able to explain better than I can on the chat box or something like that, if that works. And thank you, Melanie, for your question on the chat box. We can come back to that at the end, but would also encourage others, please do use the chat box. I think that's quite helpful if we're going along and you've got something, do put it up as we're going along. That would be great. So I'm now going to move on to Suman, who I can see on my screen. And Suman, thank you for joining us. I think many people on this call will be very familiar with ASER, but I'm sure you can tell us very briefly what ASER is. But ASER has been going for many years in India as a very well-established grassroots program that's been working in India to promote evidence-based change through community engagement. So it would be really helpful to hear from you on the way that the pandemic is affecting the way that ASER is able to collect and use data to tackle the challenges that communities are currently facing, and any experience that you see from this for others wanting to use evidence to promote change at the grassroots level in particular during this period. Thanks, Suman.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Good evening, everyone. As Pauline said, I am the Director of Research at ASER Center. ASER Center is the research and assessment arm of a much larger organization, which is Pratham Education Foundation, an NGO that has worked for about a quarter of a century now to support children's schooling and learning in India. And as Pauline just mentioned, what probably ASER is best known for is the annual ASER survey, which is a large-scale, rapid, household-based assessment of schooling and foundational learning status that we conduct every year across India. And we also conduct a variety of other research studies. Among them currently is one that is funded by the RLO, which is probably why I was invited to this webinar. And it's a project that we are conducting in collaboration with the Real Center at the University of Cambridge. What I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes actually has relatively little to do with the project itself, though I will draw in some lessons that we're learning there. But since ASER, the word ASER in Hindustani means impact, and since ASER Center's tagline is evidence for action, I thought that in the next few minutes, I would just share some thoughts on some key lessons that we're learning about the kinds of evidence and the kinds of actions that we need to deal with the impact of COVID in this post-COVID world. So jumping right into the first part, which is about evidence. Right now, we know that governments and others all across the world are rolling out all kinds of distance education platforms and mechanisms. And the aim of those is, of course, to provide some kind of continuity to students while schools are closed. And so, although a lot of energy and a lot of resources are going into getting these mechanisms up and running, as of now, nobody really knows whether these are in fact reaching children, which children they're reaching, and with what effect. So obviously that is one first question that we feel is really important to answer. At ASER Center, since currently we are not able to go into the field and do the survey, we are this year planning to use our database from our previous big ASER in 2018, where we have more than 300,000 phone numbers from a representative sample of households across the country to do a phone-based survey where we want to ask some really very simple questions. So first we want to know whether households are even aware of these various options for distance learning that are being floated around the country. If they're aware of them, do they actually have access to them? Do they have the technological, the platforms that will enable them to access them? And if they do, then are children actually using those platforms in the ways that are intended? And of course, understanding whether these interim mechanisms are working is critical because we know that school closures and all of these other disruptions caused by COVID are going to lead to more dropouts, to more learning loss, and to even less equity with regard to who makes progress and who doesn't, which means that the global SDG 4 targets that we have established for ourselves are now even further away than they were before. But because we don't yet know the magnitude of these impacts, we will need quick measurements that are able to quickly feed into policy and action on the ground once schools and communities do open up again. And the ASER kinds of assessments we believe are ideal for this kind of task because they are rapid assessments, because they are usually conducted on scale with representative samples of children, because they're household-based, so they capture changes in enrollment patterns, and finally, because they focus on foundational learning, which are very fragile skills that are prone to learning loss when schools are closed for extended periods. And so just as an aside, I wanted to mention the fact that the People's Action for Learning, or PAL network, which some of you may know about, it is a group of organizations in 14 countries that have adopted or adapted the ASER type approach to assessment, have just this week released the International Common Assessment of Numeracy, or ICANN. And this could not have been better timing because this tool is actually aligned to SDG 4.1.1a. It is in the public domain. It is available in 11 languages. It is usable in school or in household settings. And so it can be used to generate data quickly on the situation with regard to children's basic numeracy skills. So now moving on to the other part of what I wanted to talk about, which is thinking about solutions to this crisis. What are the actions that we can actually take? I know that everyone in this room, in this call, not room, is aware that currently there's a lot of discussion around this idea of building back better after COVID. But I think it is really important that we don't only think about rebuilding the mechanisms that we had before, because we know that the system that we had before COVID wasn't working for the vast majority of children in the world. Many children in many countries were out of school. Many children in many countries who were in school were years behind in terms of expected learning outcomes. But what we're seeing currently, and this comes from Pratham, our parent organization's experience on the ground, is that the pandemic is generating new opportunities to put things back together differently. And here I'm referring specifically to the fact that because we have these new distance learning mechanisms that are being put in place, families and communities have the opportunity to engage with this thing that we call learning in ways that they were never able to do before. So just to give you one example, during the lockdown, Pratham shifted very quickly to developing a variety of new mechanisms and activities for reaching children at home. And these included WhatsApp messages, SMS messages, finding local volunteers to transmit messages to children in something like 11,000 villages across India. And now many of these activities are specifically intentionally designed to engage families. So for example, there are word games that children can play with their parents. There are simple math sums that they can do with materials that they have at home. And the feedback that we've been getting so far is that there is a huge amount of engagement, not just from children, but also from their families. And of course, this fits perfectly with what we know here in India, at least, which is that families do really believe in and support education and do everything that they can do to ensure that their children get a good education. So for example, in India, at least when schools were open, almost all children were in fact enrolled. The unfortunate fact is that there are no mechanisms in place within the education system that will help us ensure that this kind of engagement, this kind of excitement will continue when schools open. But what if we did have these kinds of mechanisms? As it happens, our RLO-funded project with the Real Center addresses exactly this question. So we're asking what happens if school and community actors work together to support children's learning. And so while I don't have an answer for you and won't for a couple of years, we're in early stages of the research, I want to share just one statistic that illustrates how far apart schools and families are. And this is a gap that is going to need to be bridged if we are to make progress in building these bridges. And that statistic from the baseline assessment is that among more than 20,000 parents of children currently in early primary grades whom we interviewed, these parents are children with parents of children in primary school. 7 out of 10 could not even name a teacher in their child's school, could not even name a teacher. So when we think about building back better, it is really important to find ways to ensure that this engagement that we know is possible can continue and thrive even once schools do open and we're back to business as usual. So my last point, I'm almost done, Pauline, is the other new thing that we are seeing as a result of the pandemic is that, and as the colleague from South Africa also mentioned, new spaces for collaboration are opening up because nobody has the solutions to what is the challenges that are facing us currently. So we're seeing a new openness on the part of many governments to engage with us, to figure out solutions together. We're seeing new willingness from funders to switch priorities to fund COVID-related research and interventions. And of course, as Pratham and ASER, everything we've learned to date suggests that given half a chance, people do step up to the challenge. As parents, family members, community members, they have and will continue to support their children's education. So often it is not at the grassroots, but elsewhere within the education system that, as Tristan mentioned, attitudes and attitudes need to be changed so that we can bring changes into the education systems for the benefit for all our children, not just in this time of the pandemic, but even once that is over. So hopefully one good outcome of COVID is that all actors in the system learn to collaborate better in order to build back better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Suman. And I think that sort of married up really nicely with what Mpumi was saying of really building on the vast experience that ASER, together with Pratham, have already of working with communities, which has become even more vital in the current time. Also, the adaptation of methods of using phone surveys for real-time information, that can feed back through to policy, I think is a really concrete thing. So that was great to hear. I'm now going to move on to our final panelist, Laura, and for whom I've got the following question. So COVID-19 is bringing to the fore the importance of robust evidence influencing policy decisions, perhaps more than ever. We are seeing a demand for evidence, perhaps more than is usually the case. At the same time, the challenges of contradictory evidence, we're certainly seeing that in the UK in terms of what the responses are. But how do you think, from your experience within DFID and also interactions more generally, how do you think researchers can ensure that their evidence reaches global policy actors in the context of this pandemic? And any lessons that you might have seen, including from previous crises such as Ebola or other things as well? Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all. It's great to see so many of you. I work in the education research team at DFID and have worked on RLO since its inception almost, so sort of 6 months into it, so a long time now. And I guess I'm with Suman in particular. I think I'm all about finding the silver linings here, and I think it's really maybe that's where we're all at in the lockdown journey to kind of look for the positivity in life. But I've got 3 questions here that I think there are particular issues about. My 6-month-old's going to choose this moment to start bashing around. But I've got 3 questions for you to think about with particular relevance to the COVID moment. So I think overall, one of the silver linings that's come out of it is that I have never heard the words, what is the evidence for this, said more often than in the last 3 months, right? Across your whole like professional and personal life, when have you ever heard that phrase said? People are looking for data, people are looking for evidence, people are questioning their own behavior on the basis of what they're hearing. On the flip side, I think there's also a skepticism and a sort of distrust of data and evidence that's coming out of some of the contradictory things that are coming out, and some of the mistakes and issues that have been made with data, and some of the fast track publications that we know about. So the 3 questions I think are, do I need to reach the global education community? And I think, Pauline, you know, you pose a question about the global education community. I'm a member of it. We're all members in a way of it, but from the donor perspective, I'm going to fairly controversially say that mightn't be a primary audience for your research. At this moment in time, for COVID in particular, I suspect that the people who need the evidence the most, the people who need the data the most, are the decision makers in countries, policy makers, civil society, NGOs working in action on the ground. And I think that's not necessarily always, is not necessarily just in the COVID time, the COVID this year, that's going to be my message. So I think if you think about that question, and you think, yeah, actually my research is paradigm shifting focused, I aim to change the way that these guys are thinking and these lobbying strategies of these massive organizations, then that's a different question. But the reality right now is that these organizations are making fast decisions, and like all policy makers, they're not always based on the evidence. So I think there is a skepticism. My response to that first question, because you'll have your own thoughts on whether you do need to reach them. The second is, if you do think, yes, I do need to reach the global education community, I do think that I can contribute to debate that may change behavior, that may change thinking, that may change funding and program design, then how do I do it? And this is something the Impact Initiative has been working on from the start. So it's hard, we all know that, it is hard to influence, but I think it comes down to being a collective effort. There's a lot of networks out there that build messages together. Your voice is always going to be louder in a collective, right? And even now, coming out of COVID, there's a small network that's growing called the Better Network, who are coming together to think about, you know, can we work together to collect similar data in different countries that tell us the story across the different contexts? Because, you know, given the kind of strength of researcher relationships with the networking country, can we build a kind of global data and evidence network? And I think it's really fantastic that that's come so quickly out of COVID, but they exist in normal times too. So working collectively and working through intermediaries. I think it's fair to say that the things that are getting read right now are Twitter and blogs. And I know there's a cliche that the global education community only read Twitter and blogs, but you know, particularly right now, I think that is the way to reach those working in that space. So, you know, reading Brookings, reading CGD, there's a lot of kind of think tanks in between who are taking research and hopefully citing it correctly and putting it together into summaries. That's always going to be a much more accessible way for the global community to reach. And then third, that you choose your moment, you choose the right part of the audience that you're looking at, and put yourselves in their shoes. So right now, what are the global education community asking? They're asking the same questions as those in country, but they're asking it in a how do I support way. So how do I support the gathering of evidence that says when to reopen schools? How do I fund? How do I think about funding? What do I fund in terms of the priorities for what needs to be spent now and what needs to be spent after all of this happened? Obviously, the reality right now is that the global education network is not in country. The advisors are not able to go and meet face-to-face ministries. The trips, the missions around the world from the UN, the World Bank, and so forth are not happening. But those, you know, obviously those relationships are still there. So it is building those relationships and knowing who has the ear, who the kind of, as I say, the right part of that global audience is. My third question is then, if my findings can have an impact, can I think about how my method or my approach to the research can have an impact too? And I think here, this comes back in a way to some of what Nompumelelo was saying earlier, who I think also spoke about a lot of silver linings, that where, you know, efficiency and effectiveness can come out of all of this COVID stuff, that you know, none of the things I think were said then are specific to COVID. I think all of this is really good advice, but can you, in your approach to research, support problem-driven design, support testing to context, support evidence-informed iteration, and therefore not only try and influence with the findings of the research, but influence in the very approach to evidence, in the very approach to research in country? And I think, again, in this COVID context, in some ways that's much harder. We're all so far away, but in some ways, maybe there's an openness to innovation, as Tristan was talking about, that could be, you know, that there might be a moment for that here. And linking to that, and the whole idea of building back better, I think it's really important when we think one step ahead, we think about whether the approach to evidence, and not just the findings, but the very idea of evidence and research can have an impact, that there are some really, really hard choices coming up. So we're not just thinking about COVID right now, but we're thinking about when we build back better, we're going to be doing so in a world, and one, we don't just want the rhetoric of it, Suman said, we want the practicality. What is it that we need to prioritize? What is it with a much smaller budget we're going to need to be advocating? Can we not have 100 voices shouting at once? Can we, how is it that we're going to deal not only with the reality that learning's not happening in schools pre-COVID, but now, you know, that more boys are at work, that girls are married or pregnant, that violence has proliferated while out of school. You know, there's all of these additional issues too. How do we work in a cross-sector way with our epidemiologists, with our health and governance advisors? Sorry.
Laura's telling you the 7 minutes is up, Laura.
So yeah, I guess that's the one final thing I wanted to say was, I think the last bit of your question, Pauline, was about can we learn from Ebola? And I think one of the really interesting things is that in looking at literature on Ebola or other pandemics, there's nothing that I could find that anything about how to get evidence into the conversation in these contexts on education. I think there's a lot in the literature on conflict that we can learn from, but specifically in terms of, I mean, there's nothing like this crisis, but you know, in terms of kind of pandemics or health crises, or you know, these immediate response moments, we don't have a whole lot to go on. And so I come back to my original point that a lot of this is the same advice I think that we would be giving in a non-COVID context. It just feels faster right now.
Great, thank you so much. I think sort of really important points about being clear about who the audience is, people's time is precious, working together so that they're not bombarded with lots of different things, etc. I'm going to move on to the question and answer. We've got about half an hour. For this, you can either put a message, something in the chat box. I've got 3 questions already, and I'm going to come to those 3 people first. So Melanie, Anjum and Sylvester, if you'd just be ready to ask your question in a moment. For others, you can either put it in the chat box, or else if you click on participants at the bottom, you will see that the list of participants comes up on your right-hand side, and it gives you the opportunity to put your hand up. So if you click on raise hand, or sometimes it has an emblem for the hand, it should mean that your hand goes up, and between us, we'll be coordinating who we can see whose hand is up. If it might be that sometimes your name isn't displaying properly, so I would just ask, if you're putting your comment, just make sure that we know who you are. When you start asking your question, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself as well, because obviously it's more difficult on this format to know who everybody is. And remember to unmute yourself if you're asking a question. I always forget that bit. So maybe if I can just start, I'm going to ask the first 3 to ask all 3 together, and so then give the panelists a chance to answer those 3. And if I just ask the panelists to be quite brief, just maybe focus on ones that are particular to you, so we have time for as many questions as possible. So Melanie, if I start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Pauline. Melanie Aaron, professor in educational governance at the Vrije University in Amsterdam, previously University College London. I was asking a question to Tristan, who raised the point of the need to co-create knowledge in as part of research projects, as that would lead to greater buy-in. I was just wondering if you had any specific examples of how you did that in your work. I guess it also speaks to having to build networks, because you have to build networks to be able to do that. But did you also choose or make specific decisions on research design to enable that type of co-creation, for example?
Thanks, Melanie. And so then Anjum. And unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it may be the time of the day. I'm Anjum Halai, Professor of Education at the Aga Khan University in Pakistan. My question is to the panel as a whole. When we talk about impact, and earlier in the introductory remarks, Pauline did mention about thinking about impact right from the beginning of the research and not as an afterthought. The question is how impact very often, it's difficult to establish a causal relationship in a social situations like education, because so many other factors are also contributing to a particular change. So I wanted to hear from the panelists how do they build it into the design features of the research so that it is possible to make evidence-based claims regarding conceptual, instrumental, or process-based impact.
Thank you, Anjum. And then the last one for this round. Sorry, I've lost the, it's difficult to scroll back up again, I found. Sylvester.
Hi, I'm Sylvester, and I'm a professor in game science, and I'm currently leading a GCRF project in Southeast Asia in terms of the use of games and play in social resilience. So my question is very much around the engagement with community, as well as to make sure that everything is equitable, and with the challenges with COVID-19, based on your experience in your own projects as well as initiatives, what would you advise us to look into in terms of the methods, perhaps, or perhaps tools that we can actually use, and how can we ensure that the partners are looked after and we're prepared to go into the field and in however ways and using whatever tools that they can have access to.
Thanks. In your comment, you also mentioned that you're planning to use splots, which sounds very interesting, but
yes.
I wasn't sure what splots was.
Yes, it is. That is one of the things that we looked at the moment. Splots stands for the smallest possible online tool. So it is actually an open access tool that will allow you to collect data. So anyone can share feedbacks, anyone can share images, and it will also allow people to share stuff anonymously, especially when we are working with the community and they don't feel comfortable in sharing some of their deep thoughts, quote unquote. So using that particular approach will allow anyone to come in and let us know what they feel about the interventions, perhaps. So this is something that we are currently using in some of the other projects, but we are trying to see if we can actually use the same in Southeast Asia, because, but then again, in terms of the issues with COVID-19, not everyone will have access to online tools. So that is one of the key things that we are trying to look into, really.
Great, it's really interesting. Tristan, maybe I'll start with you. There was a direct question directed at you in particular, and anything else?
Thanks, yes, thank you very much.
If the panelists wouldn't mind being quite brief, just so that we can make sure we get as many other responses
sure.
in.
Yeah, thanks very much, Melanie, for the question. Yeah, so I mean, the answer is we have, in this particular project, we haven't built up experience of this yet because we were sort of cut off in our prime, as it were. The project started in February, and before we were able to start that particular phase of the work, you know, everything went into lockdown. But maybe I can just say something about how we built it into the project. And I mean, we had to push quite a lot for the funding of this, because we left a portion of our project relatively undefined, and you know, I'm really pleased that the funders recognized that there was something in that. So what we have is that each of our 12 participating universities is going to create their own intervention through a participatory action research group of lecturers, students, and community members, and some senior management of the institution as well. And we thought this was important, partly because of buy-in that you mentioned, and also because, of course, they know their local needs, and that the adaptation and mitigation needs of climate change are very context specific. But also because it's an essentially human process. I mean, some of the things might be kind of material and technical, but a lot of it is about changing people, and it's essential for people to actually participate in that transformatory experience for the impact to happen. So that's the idea. I'm afraid this is to my mind, I mean, there are silver linings, but I see this as one of the most difficult aspects of this, because I think there is you know, for the people who are already hard to reach, you know, they've become harder to reach in the context of coronavirus. And it's much harder to engage in that kind of grassroots work than it is other kinds of impact work at the moment. So I think it's a real challenge that we've got.
Thanks, Tristan. Suman, would you like to say anything in relation to any of the other chat questions?
Maybe just quickly to respond to Anjum's question on what causes impact. And of course, that's a really difficult question to answer unless you're running an RCT, which is, again, an answer only in a very circumscribed set of circumstances. And I think that for us, at least at ASER and Pratham, what causes impact is having people recognize that there's a problem in the first place. So when we're doing an assessment of children's learning, for example, what we see causes impact instantly is when somebody takes this simple text and finds that a child who's been in school for 3 or 4 or 5 years can't read it. That person is generating their own evidence for themselves, and that causes them to recognize that there is a problem, and that causes impact in all kinds of ways, depending on who that person is and where they is. That might be in the family, it might be in an education system, it might be in an NGO, but that is a first step. So this is not talking specifically, of course, about our RLO project, but in general, the question of having an impact requires the people or person you want to see an impact on recognize that there is something that they need to think differently about in the first place. I'll just stop there for the moment.
Thank you. And for me?
Yeah, same. Just adding to what Suman said, I think, and maybe addressing some of what Sylvester asked around equity in this time. So I think for us, for example, the case of infrastructure and providing proper infrastructure in all schools has, I mean, it's been going on forever. It's not a new problem. What's happening now, though, in terms of equity is it's becoming, it's establishing how much of a problem that this is currently, right? So if you're concerned about equity in that context, it's finding that data that we've always had about schools that don't have access to water and proper sanitation, and elevating that as something that should be addressed as a priority right now. I mean, I think it also relates to the building back better component. So that kind of benefit, that kind of advocacy would not just address COVID-19 now and reducing infections or death, but it would be a long-term benefit to the system. Similar with a question asked below and a comment I think Tristan made around telephonic surveys, that people who are vulnerable are even more harder to reach currently. And so there's a moment now to look at how we can collect information for people, review that, write that up, and propose ways in which moving forward, we can do that in a much more robust way. And that would be a longer term benefit, better networks, etc. Something unfortunately that we can't do now, but that would in the future, the next time something like this happens, put us in a better position.
Great, thank you. Laura, do you want to add anything?
Just one quick point on impact on the second question, that while I personally would consider impact of research to be contributing to debate and recognizing that causality between research and policy changes is in no way a linear or quick process, the unfortunate reality is that funders of research, particularly policy funders of research, will have a fairly rigid results framework that has children's learning outcomes increase as a result of investment in the research. So those people funding the research are under constant pressure to highlight stories from research like yours that say, you changed a minister's mind, or you changed the way that an intervention happened because of the findings of your research. And that's why I linked earlier to thinking not only about findings, but approach. Because if we can make the argument that this research resulted in a more evidence-informed debate in country that led to a more, a better prioritized or diagnosed response to an issue, that also helps for the future funding of research.
Great, thanks, Laura. So we have, I've got Gabrielle, who's got the question about phone surveys, that good to hear from others in response to, as well as Bela. But if anyone else has a question, you don't have to worry about writing the whole question out. If that takes time, just put, I have a question, and I will come to you. Or, as I said, put your hand up if you've worked out that facility. So Gabrielle, if you unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you very much to all the panelists and to everyone that's here. Thank you so much for the inputs around ASER. I found it very interesting, Suman. And I think the question I raised really was about how representative are these phone surveys? So, I mean, we're doing work at the moment in South Africa, trying to do some phone surveys and trying to get a nationally representative sample. And it's challenging for a number of reasons, even when you have a sampling frame, because poorer households change telephone numbers. And how accurate or reflective do you think that information is that parents are giving? And then do you think that there's any room for using telephone surveys to get a sense of how children are doing, or even SMS, to get a sense of whether they can read text as a way of tracking learner performance in any way or results? I mean, I'd be interested in getting your feedback on that.
Great, thank you. I think a very valid question for the research that is currently possible, if anything. And Bela.
Thank you. You know, amidst all the conversation on deficits and learning losses, inequity, there's also a strong conversation going on innovations and agency during COVID-19. And there is some evidence to say that, you know, these innovations do abound. Anecdotal, they're early speculations, but, you know, how can something like that be measured and, you know, deconstructed and, as I say, sustained in the new normal? Because, you know, as there's a conversation on schools reopening or opening and closing, there is something else that's happened in between wherever there has been a kind of activity going on learning, as it has been in some of our work. But we know things are different. We know children are responding differently, and parents are too. Who are acting as intermediaries, as well as the new learning platforms, which are triggering a different kind of responses, very lively even. So that's my question in terms of how can we measure that, whatever is happening, and how can that be sustained beyond this phase? It's different. People are saying, let's reimagine education. It's going to be different. What is that different?
A very good question, Bela, and I suspect you're the right person to answer it as well, but we can also get the views of our panelists. So maybe, Suman, if I go to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Gabrielle, for the question. And you're absolutely right. The phone numbers are tricky. So that they're not, the frame that we have is a frame of households. It's a household sample from 2 years ago. And we have phone numbers for every a person, the head of the household, for those 300,000 households. And we've been doing a lot of work for the last probably couple of months now to see how many of those phone numbers still work, whether they still belong to the same people, and so on and so forth. And we are surprisingly finding that in 50% of those numbers, on the first attempt, we are able to reach the same households. And we are able to reach 70% of them on the second attempt. So, knowing those parameters, then we can adjust the sampling itself so that we are still talking about a representative sample of households. Those numbers do also change from state to state, which is quite interesting. So we will probably be adjusting the sampling strategy depending on the situation in that state. The other part of your question about actually seeing what children can do, we've decided that no, because it's not something we've ever done, it's not something we're comfortable doing. So right now we are just going to be asking parents about what is the status of these programs and whether their children are engaging or not. We're not actually going to try to do any kind of assessment of children's learning because it's tricky at the best of times, and over the phone with a young child, it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So that's not something we're even thinking about. Then to Bela's question, Bela, great question, but I think Pauline is right. You should answer it. You're right. I think there's a lot going on. There's a lot of energy in the system that one doesn't normally see. Now, whether we need to measure it is another question. Maybe we don't. Maybe what we need to do is find mechanisms to share, to transmit that energy to different people, different communities, different parts of the system so that it somehow is infectious and reaches people that it hasn't reached already. But beyond that, I think that you should answer that question. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Suman. So maybe Tristan, Mpui and Laura, could you just raise your hand if you want to add anything at this stage? No, okay. So that gives us more time for more questions. I can see Lawrence has his hand up. So maybe go to Lawrence next. And Jean-Francois, I'm going to put you on the spot because Melanie has put in the chat box that you've got a very interesting experience, an example of setting up online research labs. So she might have answered your question, put what you want to say in the chat box, but it'd be great to hear from you as well. But I'll start with Lawrence. Thank you.
Thank you. Larry Aber from the Global Ties for Children Research Center at New York University. Two really quick questions for any panelist. The first is, are you aware of longitudinal research going on that can't go into the field for the next wave of data, but that could be used to ask questions when traditional forms of research return, and or to use as the sampling frame for phone surveys, household surveys? That's one question. The second is, there's been very little discussion about the non-academic part of education, the social, emotional, mental health, psychosocial challenges, and challenges related to that in terms of distance learning and the response to COVID more generally. So two broad questions.
Two very important questions. So Jean-Francois, are you okay if I put you on the spot there?
Sure, let me try my best. Hi, Jean-Francois Trani, Washington University in St. Louis, and we have a RLO on participatory methods to promote equity and quality education in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, so to respond to the current situation of COVID-19, we are still in the process of adapting. Schools have been closed in both countries. We are working in remote rural areas. The difficulties were there before the current situation with, as you can imagine, violence in Afghanistan and quite some difficult political situation in Pakistan with the change of government last year. But so what we do is we have those group model building workshop where we bring together a limited number of participants, so even more limited now, to maintain social distancing. We provide, currently we just resume, so in this week, those workshops with children, parents, teachers, school committee members separately. We maintain social distance. We provide masks, sanitizer. We first introduce a protocol to respect the WHO guidelines, and then we engage and we change our protocol of a group model building workshop by introducing a focus group discussion, which initially was on inclusion and became on how the current situation is influencing your experience with schooling. So that works with parents, teachers, children, and members of committees. And then we keep the same structure of workshop, but we use large space. We work outside of the school when the weather allows it. And we train our team first, and then we do this, we read this hygiene distancing protocol before. And it's really interesting to see how things are shifting. So from the first round in 2018-19 and today. And of course, we have immediate results because the team write the reports immediately. So it's available. We can share with NGO partners, Ministry of Education, which as many panelists have mentioned, are so keen to have immediate data. And we also did a phone survey with teachers only who have access to phones about the COVID-19, and we will release the results in the coming week or two. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting because clearly for the foreseeable future, we're going to be needing to adapt how we do research, whether it's through phone surveys, whether it's online, whether it's through social distancing and sort of learning from each other on the experiences. And I think this also relates to Laura's point about just not seeing research only as research's sake, but also research as part of the process of impact as well as we're doing it. And that's a really strong example of that. So just to ask the panelists in relation to Larry's two-part question, and I think it's probably a question for everybody on the call, not just the panelists, and for us all to reflect on. I think perhaps the first one about adapting longitudinal research to some extent relates to what Suman was talking about, if I might understand correctly, that you've shifted from ASER, which is usually takes place every year, and has now, you've also done a phone survey version of it using that same sample. But it'd be good to hear if others know of other experiences. I know DFID is funding another number of projects, some of which might be adapting to this. Well, I know it is because I'm involved in one of them, but interesting to hear if there's others. But also I think this really important point that now more than ever, not that it wasn't important before, but now more than ever, we need to be thinking about learning, not just in the literacy and numeracy sense, and how we really make sure that we're reflecting that in the design of our research as well as in the approaches that we're adopting. So I'm going to just ask again the panelists, maybe if you put your hand up if you want to, so Mpumi, maybe start with you.
Sure. So we do have a longitudinal data collection that, where we were tracking a cohort of learners who are now in grade 6. We've been assessing them since they've been in grade 1. And now our intention had been to go and collect the information in about October. All things going according to plan. If miracles happen, we'll go in November. But in all likelihood, we'll have to shift that completely to next year in terms of the learner assessment component. And because it's longitudinal and had been designed as a randomized control trial, we do have in some ways learning measurements for a typical year, not just our intervention group component. And so we're hoping we'd be able to calculate a learning loss, how much has the average student not been able to do because of COVID-19. But aside from the learner assessment, we are intending to include quite a lot of questions to the learners, especially the older learners, all in primary school, to answer about their experiences, their wellness, any hunger issues, etc. And we are definitely going to continue doing the implementation side evaluation component. So lots of classroom observations. We will not just measure now print richness in a classroom. We'll be measuring the number of children in a classroom and spaces between desks. And if you have staggered break times, or are we still all going to break at the same time, etc. So classroom observation, teacher questionnaires, principal questionnaires, parent questionnaires, and then learner assessments and learner interviews for that component. We also have, in general, a national school monitoring survey that we do to measure progress in the sector. It's not the exact same sample we use every year, but it's always representative. And definitely the next time we go in, there'll be COVID-related questions embedded in every, I think we have about 7 instruments in all those instruments. And then finally, Gabby might want to speak a bit on this. There has been a panel data survey that's been conducted in South Africa. It's called the National Income Dynamic Study, and that happens, I think, every 2 to 3 years. And she's involved in using that sample to try and find some telephonic information for now. And I'm fairly certain even in that household survey, when they go back, there'll be some COVID-related questions specifically. And in that sense, it's the same household that they've been collecting data from for years.
Doing that thing that I've been asking others not to do, muted. That's really interesting, and I think it makes me think of something that Laura, you alluded to on this Better group in relation to sort of trying to pull together both methods and survey instruments to make sure we can move things forward quickly and learn from each other. Greg, who's here from ESRC, I think this might be something for the Global Challenges Research Fund, just to reflect on how one might help to compile these learning experiences, because I think everyone's learning on the spot, so it'd be really helpful to see if there's a way of collating this in some form. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, just to second that, and Pauline's referring to this thing called the Better group, which is a very sort of nascent and evolving group, really, of people who are starting to collect data on COVID-related questions related to education, and really out of the desire to not have everyone duplicate in terms of designing a survey, designing items, designing, you know, sort of the questions. I think from the policy perspective, to have a set of common metrics, to have data that cuts across countries, and to have that then collated by the intermediaries I talked about earlier, that then, you know, can help inform where we're making major fundraising fails or wrong decisions. I think, you know, as this evolves, that collectivity is incredibly important. Just coming back to, I think, one of Larry's questions, I know Young Lives was supposed to go out in terms of the longitudinal, you know, this was a major year for Young Lives and a real push to get into the 5th round, I think it is, of survey collection. They're trying to do what they can by phone, but of course it's all going to be incredibly different. One question I guess I've got for all of you, and this morning comes back to the how do we collate this information, is are there other surveys that are not necessarily COVID specific going out now, but other non-education surveys that we could get education questions into? You know, we're talking about LSMS right now, for example, but I guess, you know, this kind of comes out of looking at COVID as a system and as a systems issue, and seeing that actually there's, you know, this breaking down of silos in the sectors is something that maybe we need to push harder to get education questions into some others. So if there are others that you think are really sort of ready and ones that really should have them in there, then we would certainly step up the lobbying to do that. On the socio-emotional and mental health, I mean, from the policy perspective, you know, we've always been working, you know, with an education focus on learning and a kind of health focus on the mental health of students in school. This crisis again has just broken down that boundary entirely. I think it's not only, as I say, we're not only thinking about the reality of distance learning here now, but also the return to school and the sort of think a step ahead, and the, you know, what is this new normal and new reality going to look like in a lot of places. I think the real issue with socio-emotional skills is again this question around common metrics. We see so many different interpretations and metrics and even phrases for what it means, that it becomes then very difficult to filter through the evidence on it. So again, this kind of call and plea for the more kind of collective use of common terms and common metrics, I think makes it then much easier to have that impact. And I'm speaking at the global education level.
Thanks, Laura. I'm now going to come on to Tristan and Suman for any last comments, because we're now running out of time. We've got another couple of really good questions, which I don't think we're going to have time to discuss, but one from Ellen Turner on how do we ensure child safeguarding aspects of schooling continue during school closures. And I think, you know, this is absolutely vital. Even within schools, we know how difficult school safeguarding is, but we know that there's a lot of challenges that happen when schools are closed, even more greatly when schools are closed. And Gabby, thanks also for your point on the shared instruments. I think that's something we should definitely come back to. So Tristan, any last 1 minute reflection?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank Jean-Francois for a really interesting vignette of the work they're doing. It was really great to hear that, and also very encouraging, because I've been wondering how you might do that kind of participatory work in social distancing. So it's really great to hear that example. I suppose from my perspective, the difficulty is, I mean, I can see how you do, once you've already launched some work, that you can then adapt it. I think the really hard thing is to launch it. You know, building rapport and trust, and particularly sort of get over role differentials and power differentials and so forth, I think is another challenge that might be very difficult to overcome. But it's certainly good to get to hear about those experiences.
Great, thanks, Tristan. And Suman?
Yeah, maybe I just very quickly, you know, this discussion about mental health and, you know, other kinds of impacts on children and on others. And the fact that as Laura was saying, that, you know, some things are handled in the education system and some things are usually handled by the health system. I think what this pandemic is really showing us very clearly is that at every level, we have to stop working in silos. So I was thinking about the fact that on the ground, this idea of communities and schools working together, I ran out of time, so I couldn't say this in my 7 minutes, has to do with supporting children's learning, but supporting many other kinds of you know, things for children, because they spend a lot of their time at home. So, you know, it makes sense to address all of these issues in a way that is coordinated, whether it's measurements or whether it is action on the ground. I think the time is now to break out of the silos at whatever level, policy, planning, research, and think about what we can do to support children wherever we are. Yeah, I think that's about it.
So Suman, I think that's a wonderful way to end this discussion, a very, again, practical but real and important issue that is actually at the heart of what we're all about. And I think one thing that's come across to me in all of this conversation is how we need to be more than the sum of our parts. And I guess if there were a tagline for the Impact Initiative of what we would be hoping to achieve, that would be very much it. So we would look forward to continuing over the coming few months to see where there are opportunities to help collate information, work with you in whatever way we can to support that in ways that is going to be most useful to those, to the policy actors, to those who are working at the grassroots, that they have quick and useful, but also robust information that they can draw upon across the range of information. I'm just going to briefly, we're going to come on to ask Jorge to share his illustration in a moment. I think is just finishing up, so any minute now, hopefully it will pop up on the screen. But just to mention that we'll be emailing you all with both to share the recording as well as the illustration that you'll see shortly, the final version of it, and with a couple of follow-up questions that if you wouldn't mind answering. And as I said at the beginning, in a sense, this is the beginning of a conversation. There's many of you here who have really important ideas and you haven't had a chance to share them, but there will be other opportunities to share. So as I'm speaking, Jorge has very kindly put this up. Jorge, do you want to just talk us briefly as what you've got there? If you just unmute yourself. You're muted. I don't know if you're having problems with unmuting.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Well, I don't say. I think the drawing should speak for itself. There's a couple of points on the bottom right corner that I need to fill up, but I think that pretty much sums up the conversation.
Great, thank you.
I don't know if there's any specific, yeah, sure.
I like the bit that just you zoomed in on about time to be helpful. I think that was a point we started on, and it's a good point to end on as well. I think, you know, we sometimes as researchers spend our time being very critical and thinking of what the problems are. But I think what I've really got and really sort of found encouraging about this conversation is how we can actually think constructively about what we can do. But as Mpumi said at the beginning, not to say we shouldn't be critical, but actually thinking very constructively. So I think that's an illustration looks great at first glance, and we look forward to looking at it in more detail and to sharing it. So in these last couple of minutes, I just want to thank you again for all your contributions, and in particular to the panelists for taking the time, for sharing their reflections and their thinking that comes from a lot of experience. And I hope that we can continue the conversation. There will be some for the RLOs, some follow-up webinars on other topics, so we look forward to those, and I'm sure there's going to be continued activity with the Global Challenges Research Fund, and where we have opportunities to come together again, that would be great as well, because I think there's so much to learn from each other. So thank you all for your participation, and I will wish you all the good rest of your day, whatever time zone you are on.